The Zero was built around the Sakai 12 radial engine, which developed 950 horsepower at takeoff. Though not a particularly powerful engine by contemporary standards, it benefited from the Zero's lightweight construction and provided the plane with good wing loading and climb rate. When fitted with a drop tank, which the Japanese used routinely, it was also an extraordinarily long-ranged fighter, capable of operating as much as 300 miles from the carrier. However, it was also lightly built, almost totally unarmoured, and did not possess self-sealing fuel tanks. It was, in short, a very easy machine to be killed in if the enemy managed to get a good shot, as the pilot was exposed to gunfire and vulnerable to fires and explosions as well. Thus far, however, the Allied fighters hadn't been able to get the measure of the Zero in combat. The Navy's dive bomber was the large Aichi Type 99 D3A1 carrier bomber, in Japanese, Kanjo Bakugekiki, referred to by its abbreviated form Kanbaku. These powerful aircraft were notable for their spatted landing gear and graceful elliptical wings. A two-seat plane, pilot and radio operator, Chao rear gunner, they were ruggedly constructed to survive the rigours of screaming down at steep angles and high speeds. Their armament was either a 250 kilo, 550 lb armour-piercing bomb or a 242 kilo, 532 lb high-explosive weapon. The Japanese had already demonstrated that their pilots were some of the best in the world, capable of hitting fast-moving warships routinely. If the Type 99 had one drawback, it was the weight of its payload. Its opposite number in the US Navy, the SBD Dauntless, was capable of carrying a $1,000 lb bomb. Still, the Type 99 had proven itself a worthy airplane in all theatres of combat, and was rightly to be feared for its accuracy. The third major plane in the Navy's carrier inventory was the Nakajima Type 97, B5N2, carrier attack aircraft, Kanjo Kogekiki, or just KANK for short. The Type 97 was a dual-role aircraft and could perform both level bombing as well as torpedo attacks. In the first role, it could be armed with up to 800 kilos, 1,760 lb, of bombs. In its anti-shipping role, it was armed with a Type 91 torpedo instead. Manned by 3 crewmen, pilot, observer, bombardier, radio operator, tail gunner, the Type 97 was a solid performer. It was markedly superior to its counterparts in the US Navy in terms of speed, as well as the altitude and speed at which it could release its torpedo. This last advantage was more the function of the ordnance than the plane, as the Japanese Type 91 torpedo was a much more reliable and robust weapon than its American equivalent. In addition to these 3 proven mainstays, Operation MI would also witness the debut of a new carrier aircraft. Soryu had on board her at least 1, and likely 2, prototypes of the much-anticipated successor to the Type 99 dive bomber, the Yokosuka D4Y1 Suisei, Comet. These pre-production models had been modified for reconnaissance work because they had good range and high cruising speed. Having been worked up by 2 of Soryu's Type 99 crews, they were now along in place of 2 of the 18 kanbaku normally carried by the carrier. They would be used in a scouting role if necessary. The basic tactical building block of every aircraft formation was the 3-plane shotai. Led by a shotaicho, the shotai was roughly equivalent to a section or element in a Western Air Force. A shotai typically flew in an inverted V pattern, with the lead aircraft slightly below the 2 trailing aircraft. The formation was looser than the old-style British 3-plane Vic and somewhat more flexible. The Japanese had not yet picked up on the more useful 4-plane formations that now dominated aerial tactics in the European theatre, and that had already been copied by the Americans. A group of 2 or 3 shotai composed a chutai, equivalent to a division. At the beginning of the Pacific War, all carrier aircraft used a 9-plane chutai organization. However, around March 1942, the KANK groups had begun shifting over to 6-plane chutai, most likely because it provided more flexible target selection capabilities for the squadron as a whole. Dive bombers, however, still used 9-plane Chutai at Midway, as did the fighters. In the case of fighters, the Chutai formation was not really used tactically, the Zero pilots reverting to the 3-plane Shotai formation during the heat of combat. Bombers, though, tended to maneuver and attack by Chutai. The leader of the Chutai was typically a lieutenant, designated the Buntaich. The entire ship's establishment of a given type of aircraft was typically composed of 2 or 3 Chutai. Each squadron was designated according to the type of plane composing it. Thus, a Kanjo Kogeki-kitai was a torpedo bomber squadron, whereas a carrier's Zero unit was the Kanjo Sentokitai, and so on. The squadron was led by the senior Buntaicho among the 2 or more Buntaicho that served in it. When operating with another carrier's matching Kitai, the senior Buntaicho among the 2 groups would lead the composite unit. The combination of all 3 of an individual carrier's squadrons resulted in the Hikokitai, or carrier air group, commanded by either a lieutenant commander or commander, known as the Hikotaich. The Hikokitai was referred to by the ship's name, for example, Akagi Hikokitai. However, unlike the US Navy, which at this point in the war did not actively employ a tactical organization higher than the individual carrier air group, during the China War the Japanese had taken the concept of massing air power one step further by combining the air establishments of a carrier division, Koku Sentai, into a virtual combat organization of its own. To the Japanese, the carrier division, not the individual carrier, was the fundamental operational grouping, and naval air doctrine was centered on combined strikes using these groups. Daiichi Kido Butai had been employing this practice since the beginning of the war, wielding a minimum of 2 and often 3 carrier divisions. Having discussed Japanese aircraft and air unit organization, it is necessary to turn to a brief discussion of Japanese carrier doctrine and organization. Most readers of military history don't understand doctrine and don't want to, because it has no place in the tales of individual soldiers or great military leaders that they are used to. Indeed, doctrine is often seen as an unnecessary encumbrance that loses battles and gets in the way of exercising creative command. This is ironic, in that one of the prevalent goals behind doctrine is the simplification and streamlining of command, precisely so that commanders can fashion appropriate solutions during battle. Much of this disinterest in doctrine, particularly in the United States, stems from 2 factors. The first probably has much to do with the American temperament, which has always placed a premium on allowing talented individuals the freedom to do things their own way. American civilian culture emphasizes individuality and the ability to improvise successfully under challenging circumstances. Along with this comes a unique American mistrust of dogma of any kind, religious, political, or cultural, on top of which is sprinkled a profound societal suspicion of overly professional militaries. Not only that, but doctrine itself is just impossibly dull for the average reader, and isn't noticeably livelier for the professional for that matter. It is not surprising, therefore, that works on military doctrine have hardly been bestsellers in the United States. The other factor is that few devotees of military history actually know precisely what doctrine is or understand its purpose in battle. Doctrine is just procedures you've got to follow. Yet, while it is true that doctrine does contain a mandatory element, this does not satisfactorily answer why militaries have doctrine. It also must be admitted that the basic criticism of amateurs that doctrine atrophies the ability of commanders to reason critically contains a kernel of truth. Doctrine does have a potential downside, in that it can stifle creativity if it is applied in an unthinking manner. At its simplest, doctrine is the body of formal knowledge that tells a fighting force how it is expected to fight. Strictly speaking, doctrine is bigger than tactics, in that doctrine encompasses not only the means for actually handling forces in battle, but also augments it with a command structure and communications procedures that ensure that its directives are carried out. Wayne Hughes, whose book on naval tactics is probably the best modern offering in the field, describes doctrine as the intellectual glue that holds tactics together. It is more than what is written in the manual. It is the corpus of guiding principles that warriors believe in and act on. The development of doctrine is the natural imperative of any military trying to rise above the level of being merely an armed mob. It is an essential means by which militaries compensate for the negatives of warfare by building a certain measure of automatic behavior into the organization. Indeed, in the terrible crucible of combat, under the enormous pressures created by mass violence, doctrine is sometimes the only thing that holds forces together and allows them to continue fighting. By setting out a coherent set of tactical goals, units can continue to operate even if the chain of command is disrupted or destroyed. From the perspective of command, doctrine pays dividends in that it allows the commander to focus on the big picture. Leaders can be secure in the knowledge that their forces will, to a certain extent, be able to think for themselves and thereby behave with some manner of predictability. The ability to impose any sort of predictability on the chaos of warfare is a commodity to be treasured. It is for this reason that militaries pour huge amounts of time and money into creating combat doctrine and training their forces to follow it. The Japanese were certainly no different from their foreign contemporaries in this respect. Why does this matter to a study of the Battle of Midway? Because without understanding a navy's doctrine, how and why it fights the way it does cannot truly be understood. Indeed, a great many retrospective questions along the lines of, "Why didn't Admiral so-and-so just do such and such?" can often be answered, because it wasn't part of their doctrine. Going against doctrine is almost always a dicey proposition within a military culture. Doctrinal innovators, even if they win the battle, will still be riddled with second-guessing regarding their approach, as if the victory were somehow tainted by heterodoxy. Worse yet awaits the commander who violates doctrine and loses. Unfortunately, for the past 60 years, almost every Western historian who has written on the Battle of Midway has made the assumption that Japanese carriers and naval aviation forces behaved pretty much like their Western counterparts. In fact, in many respects, they did not. The reasons the Japanese operated differently stemmed from a host of factors, starting with cultural and strategic imperatives, but also including technology and warship design. A grounding in Japanese doctrine is therefore a prerequisite for evaluating the performance of Nagumo's force during the battle. Fortunately, these principles, although poorly understood in the West until recently, are relatively simple to relate. The fundamental principle that informed all Japanese doctrine was the need to offset the advantages of the United States, an opponent whose industrial base was incomparably stronger than Japan's, and whose navy was mandated by the Washington and London naval treaties to be more powerful. The Japanese were thus caught in the intellectual vice of trying to devise the means to fight the Americans on a geopolitical landscape that guaranteed them fewer military assets at the outset and no hope of procuring long-term economic superiority. The result of these pressures were manifold and affected everything from the formulation of national strategy down to the level of tactics and equipment. In terms of Japanese naval doctrine, there were two chief effects. First, the overriding need to compensate for numerical inferiority resulted in a tactical doctrine that elevated the principle of using coordinated massed firepower to the status of divine law. Likewise, striking first, at longer range and with more powerful weaponry, was seen as the only possible antidote to American numerical preponderance. This was a rather archetypal quality versus quantity response, and the Japanese pursued this goal with a single-mindedness that would have been laudable had it not been so narrow-minded. Before the war, it was presumed that the likely venue of Japan's superior firepower would be a decisive battle fought in the Western Pacific. Here, the Japanese would draw the American battle line to its eventual doom, relying first on coordinated night torpedo attacks delivered from cruisers and destroyers to whittle the American force down to size. Once the American battle line had been damaged and disorganized, a more conventional surface battle would be joined. In that culminating fight, devastating long-range gunfire from the Japanese battle line would complete the victory. It was for this battle that the Japanese Navy trained, to the exclusion of almost all else. As is often the case, though, overemphasis on one mission was detrimental to the balance of the force as a whole, as well as its thinking processes. Put simply, Japanese doctrine was warped. It placed an unrealistic emphasis on one type of battle and largely ignored the other traditional missions of Great Navy's sea control, amphibious power projection, and the protection of the nation's seaborne commerce. The result was that, by the late 1930s, Japanese tactical doctrine was an almost Baroque ode to the principle of the offensive. And while it contained many elements that would serve the Japanese well during the first part of the Pacific War, superior night fighting capabilities being a notable example, it was not an honest intellectual basis on which to build a successful warfighting approach. The second major manifestation of the pressures placed on the Japanese Navy was to be found in its weapons systems. In a certain sense, warships and aircraft can be viewed as physical manifestations of doctrine. This only makes sense. Weapons systems should be designed to operate in the fashion in which a navy as a whole intends to fight. Budgetary pressure and politics being what they are, most designs are usually modified away from the purely doctrinal requirements that spawned them. However, the warships and aircraft of the Japanese Navy as a whole represented a fairly congruent implementation of the Navy's intended approach to fighting a war. Japanese warships emphasized speed and offensive firepower, elements that suited the tactical homogeneity the Japanese always sought. These same general tenets were reflected in the Navy's aircraft, with their preference for range, firepower, and maneuverability. Conversely, Japanese warships placed less importance on structural strength, stability, protection, and damage control. Likewise, Japanese planes were built to dish it out, but weren't really intended to take it. They tended to amplify the advantages of a superbly trained pilot, but neglected the preservation of that pilot's life. Both Japanese ships and aircraft were more suited to a short naval conflict, where loss of human capital was less critical. They were not the calling cards of a navy with true staying power. It can be argued that Japan's naval aviation forces were slightly more immune to the creeping orthodoxy that was slowly choking the Navy's ability to think creatively. This had more to do with the newness of naval aviation technology than anything else. By the 1930s, the battleship was a known commodity, a relatively mature technology. Such technologies tend to develop in a more incremental fashion, and their mode of employment is typically well understood. Indeed, apart from the longer range of the weapons, the commander of a battleship at Jutland would not have been impossibly out of his element standing 20 years later on the bridge of Yamato. The aircraft carrier, in contrast, was the Wild West of the world's major navies. It was an immature weapons system, being created in front of everyone's eyes out of whole cloth. Nobody knew how carriers were supposed to fight or how they would be integrated within their respective naval forces. Both the ships and their aircraft were undergoing frantic, almost frightening technological changes, and their capabilities were improving at phenomenal rates. This, in turn, continually opened up new tactical and operational possibilities. Under such circumstances, carrier doctrine was a slate that had to be constantly written, erased, and then rewritten as new technological imperatives outmoded yesterday's beliefs. Not surprisingly, this dynamic environment attracted individuals who were comfortable with a certain degree of ambiguity and who had the ambition to put their stamp on the emerging air arm. Simply put, there was more room for innovation in the area of naval aviation than perhaps anywhere else within the Japanese Navy. However, despite the influence of mavericks like Yamamoto and Genda, naval aviation could not help but be influenced by certain tenets of Japanese naval thought. The principle of delivering integrated massed firepower against an objective was an idea that flowed naturally out of the gun club and into the carrier force. Mass has always been a cardinal military principle, and it was this desire for mass that ultimately led to the establishment of the world's first true carrier striking force, 1st Air Fleet, Dai-ichi Koku Kantai, in April 1941. The basic idea for this formation had apparently been Genda's. According to him, he had been watching a movie newsreel wherein the US fleet was briefly featured. There he had caught a glimpse of the US fleets Lexington and Saratoga parading in company with Yorktown and Enterprise. To Gender's way of thinking, massing carriers could be used for much more than simply making a good-looking film clip. It suddenly became clear to him that carriers could be grouped for tactical purposes, using hundreds of aircraft to project large bursts of devastating firepower. It took some doing, but eventually Gender persuaded Rear Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, who in turn went directly to the Navy Minister to ensure the formation of the organization Gender envisioned. First Air Fleet's establishment was a truly revolutionary development. For the first time in history, there existed an agglomeration of naval air assets, ships, planes, pilots, and doctrine, that had the potential to create strategically meaningful results on the battlefield. The British and American navies had clearly influenced this development. The Japanese were keenly aware of the British carrier operation against the Italian fleet at Taranto, for instance. But it was the Imperial Navy that first established massed naval air power at an operational level. By doing so, it had moved naval aviation out of its previous scouting, raiding role and transformed it into a decisive arm of battle. The attack on Pearl Harbor represented the first clear-cut triumph of this new mode of warfare, and it is a simple statement of fact that in 1941 no other navy in the world could have implemented such a daring aerial assault. Kid Butai alone possessed the combat assets and abilities to do so. Pearl Harbor demonstrated irrefutably that the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer beholden to the West. It had clearly eclipsed the Royal Navy in terms of naval aviation and was in some ways more advanced than the US Navy as well. This was particularly true with regards to integrating multiple aircraft carriers into a cohesive fighting force. Massing and coordinating multi-carrier air groups was something that the Japanese did exceedingly well. When employed in this way, Japanese doctrine prescribed attacking targets with groups of aircraft containing elements of all three disciplines: fighters, dive bombers, and carrier attack planes, acting in either a torpedo or level bombing capacity. In multi-division attacks, an entire carrier division would contribute matched air groups to the overall effort, launching both of its dive bomber units, for instance, while a second division would launch its 2 carrier attack bomber units. These 4 squadrons, 70 or more combat aircraft, would be escorted by fighters contributed by all 4 carriers. On follow-up strikes, the air group compositions would be reversed, with the 1st Division sending up its torpedo bombers, and the 2nd contributing the dive bombers. The result was that Japanese carriers could launch large, well-balanced strikes against their enemies. To support this favoured mode of attack, the Japanese evolved a practice known as deck-load spotting, wherein a carrier would launch about half of its air group at any one time, a complete attack unit of some sort, torpedo or dive bombers, and usually a chutai of fighters. With this initial force launched, the carrier would still retain half of its striking power for follow-up operations. This practice probably grew out of the impracticality of launching the carrier's complete air group. Such a group would need to be spotted and launched in 2 separate deck cycles, thus keeping the first half of the strike package waiting in the air over the force and burning precious fuel, while the second portion was spotted and launched, an operation that could take at least half an hour to complete. With a deck-load strike, though, the Japanese launched a group that fit comfortably on the flight deck and still had sufficient tactical weight. Indeed, the smaller carriers like Hiryu and Soryu would have had difficulty in spotting a larger force in any case, because their decks would not accommodate the extra aircraft and still leave enough run-off room forward for takeoff. Deck-load strikes had worked well for the Japanese thus far in the war, because they left little question as to each carrier's contribution and lent themselves well to aggregating aircraft for an initial strike. Interestingly, this practice stood in direct contrast with how the US Navy ran its carriers. US flat-tops could, and occasionally did, send their entire air group aloft, although the complications this introduced into the deck cycles of their carriers would plague them throughout the coming battle. Having worked well for the Japanese, the practice of using deckload strikes was apparently no longer questioned. Herein lies the cardinal issue that any analysis of Japan's options at Midway revolves around above all things. The Japanese believed in massing air power, since delivering concentrated firepower at range was considered the most effective way of attacking the enemy. In the words of Ugaki, this concentrated use of carriers has advantages, making it possible to command them so that their movement can be concealed, combined defense against an enemy attack is facilitated, and a combined simultaneous attack can be launched. As a result, Japanese carrier commanders tended to look for tactical solutions that allowed air power to be deployed in an integrated, multi-divisional fashion. The weakness of this approach is apparent to anyone who has studied military affairs, namely that in combat there are other factors worth considering besides mass, most notably speed. Thus far in the war, the Japanese had never been presented with a situation where the speed of their spotting and launching activities might well be more important than the combat mass delivered thereby. It remained to be seen whether Japanese air doctrine could react appropriately to such circumstances should they arise. As his ships steamed eastward on the 29th, Nagumo took the opportunity of conducting limited air group training. After the battle, Nagumo would be bitter in his assessment of his flyers' deficiencies. Carrier landings, torpedo and bombing attack, air combat, and practically every other index of air group efficiency came in for scathing treatment from Kid Butai's chief. However, upon closer examination, it is likely that these shortcomings were less real than that they were simply sour grapes on the part of Nagumo. There's no question that the carriers of Kid Butai had not had a lot of formal training during the previous 6 months. Torpedo practice, which was typically carried out on well-marked ranges at major bases, was certainly lacking. Training ranges were required because aerial torpedoes were a precious commodity. It was therefore important to have the necessary facilities to retrieve, refurbish, and then reissue them to the air units. Yet, except for a short sojourn in home waters immediately after Pearl Harbor, and again in May when Kid Butai returned to Japan, the carriers had spent most of their time in remote waters with relatively primitive facilities. Anchorages like Staring Bay were precisely that, a protected place to drop anchor, but hardly bases in the operative sense of the word. There were no torpedo or bomb ranges readily available in these locations. There were also usually no large airfields nearby that could accommodate the air groups from as many as 6 carriers at a time, meaning that even if training was attempted, it could only be done sporadically or in smaller groups. The only large-scale training undertaken before May was around Kendari during late March, in preparation for the raids in the Indian Ocean. During this time, the flyers had drilled in large groups and had sought to implement new tactics learned as a result of battle lessons. It would appear that the Kendari sessions were more than just brush-ups. They were formally intended to maintain and even improve the proficiency of the air units through a brief regimen of intensive training. Thus, when Kid Butai engaged in combat in the Indian Ocean in April, its overall efficiency appears to have been good. Upon returning to the inland sea, the carrier air groups had been split up and sent to various land installations. Akagi's group was at Kagoshima in the extreme southern tip of Japan. Hiryu's was some 80 miles northeast at Tomitaka, near Saeki. Kaga's Kankotai was based about 25 miles southeast of Kagoshima at Kanoya, with Soryu's close by at Kasanohara. Some of the bomber leaders were sent to Iwakuni, located just west of Hiroshima. Even with this distribution, the majority of the aircraft were within 80 miles of each other, which was a fairly easy distance as far as coordinating group exercises was concerned. It is true that the training undergone by the air units immediately before Midway was not satisfactory in all respects. For one thing, the majority of the carrier training had to occur on Kaga, because the other 3 carriers were in and out of dry dock and provisioning at Kure during this time. As a result, the majority of the exercises necessarily had to be done from the land bases, because Kaga could only handle a limited number of aircraft during this time. However, the bottom line was that Kido Butai was still a very proficient force. the intensive workups before Pearl Harbor had already honed these men to a high degree of readiness, and despite the operational losses and transfers that had occurred since then, there were still a very large number of these senior aviators left. Thus, Nagumo's comments regarding the bare margin of proficiency of his young flyers in such basics as carrier landings seem a bit disingenuous, because by and large these were the same men who had been performing carrier landings routinely for the last 6 months in combat conditions. Because of Kid Butai's heavy schedule, all of its aircraft had been constantly in use: fighters for combat air patrol, dive bombers for ASW patrols, and Kankotai for long-range scouting around the fleet, meaning that stick time for the pilots was hardly a problem. Nagumo's comments regarding his aviators are further laid bare by a detailed examination of the composition of his air group personnel in June 1942. Fully 70% of the pilots in Kid Butai's 4 dive bomber units were Pearl Harbor veterans. The situation in the Kankotai groups was even better, with 85% of the pilots being Pearl Harbor alumni. Every single pilot in Akagi's Kankotai had been with the ship in December 1941. Furthermore, many of the new pilots in the air groups were senior petty officers who had most likely been culled out of shoreside training commands and other billets. Thus, even the replacement aviators very often also were experienced men. Furthermore, they had been introduced into the air units in dribs and drabs over the course of the previous 6 months, meaning that they had had plenty of time to adjust to their units and get to know their shipmates. It is true that the air crews may have been employing their weapons less frequently, particularly their torpedoes. For instance, it is unlikely that any of Cardiff 1's or 2's Kankotai squadrons had dropped a torpedo in anger against an enemy target since Pearl Harbor. It is possible, therefore, that torpedo proficiency in the Kankotai may have been reduced. Yet this was but one index of air group readiness. And in a broader sense, the evidence seems to indicate that the air crews still retained proficiency in the employment of their ordnance. In the Indian Ocean, the dive bombers had demonstrated on 2 separate occasions that they were perfectly capable of attacking fast-moving warships. Even the relatively junior carriers of Cardiff 5 had performed credibly during the recent battles in the Coral Sea. It is hard, therefore, to discredit the quality of the aviators in any of Japan's fleet carrier divisions at this point in the war. Thus, in the final analysis, the comments in Nagumo's report must be taken with a large grain of salt. A much more clear-cut problem was the number of planes in Nagumo's air groups. The truth was that when it came to aircraft complements throughout the fleet, things weren't just fraying around the edges, they were downright awful. The Pearl Harbor operation had resulted in aircraft being stripped from other units to beef up Kid Butai. After the operation had concluded, some of those units had been returned, but many of the smaller carriers were still little better than paper tigers. These flat tops were flying fewer aircraft than they could carry, and in several cases were being forced to use planes that weren't fit for frontline service. Japan had not started the war at a running start in terms of aircraft production either. Of the major manufacturers devoted to carrier aircraft production, Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and Aichi only Mitsubishi's fighter line was running well. Rumour in the fleet had it that there were production problems back at the other 2 because carrier attack aircraft in particular were in short supply. In fact, Nakajima had stopped production of the Type 97 altogether in anticipation of fielding the new Tenzan torpedo bomber, and had to be asked to restart production to meet war needs. Aichi, the builder of the D-3A Type 99 dive bomber, was in the same position. It was focusing all of its efforts on ironing out the production issues associated with the new D-4Y and was neglecting production of the older platform. Consequently, by the middle of 1942, production of carrier bombers and attack aircraft had temporarily ground to a near halt and was completely insufficient to replace ongoing combat and operational losses. Japan would produce just 56 carrier attack aircraft during all of 1942, a pathetically low figure. Thus, even though Japan had won a string of stunning victories and its combat losses had been extraordinarily light for the territory it had gained, Japan's aircraft industry was not keeping up with even these modest demands. The result was a dramatic shortage of aircraft making their way to the fleet. Here at the edge of the sword, in Nagumo's own force, the effects were obvious. When the war had opened, Kid Butai's air groups had been full strength, although without as many spare aircraft as would have been optimal. But by June 1942, the situation had deteriorated. At the time of Pearl Harbor, Akagi had carried 66 aircraft. Now she had just 54. Kaga had been cut from 75 to 63. Soryu and Hiryu had come down from 63 apiece to 54 apiece. Nominally, each squadron, fighter, bomber and torpedo bomber, should have been allotted 3 spare aircraft for a total of 9 per ship. None were now carried by any ship in Kid Butai, and Kaga was the only ship that still retained an oversized squadron of 27 torpedo bombers. The rest of the ships were all operating 18 aircraft squadrons, with no spares. In a nutshell, each of the Kid Butai carriers had suffered a 16% decrease in their fighting power since December. Any casualties to the operating air groups, even damaged aircraft, would immediately impact the tactical cohesion of the air units, since there were no spare aircraft to feed into the formations. However, in addition to the organic air strength of the carriers themselves, Kid Butai also had guests along for the operation. Each carrier in the force was ferrying Zeros of the 6th Air Group, 6th Kokutai, often abbreviated simply 6th K, which were intended as the future garrison of Midway. 12 of these fighters were on board Junyo with the 2nd Carrier Striking Force, but the remainder were assigned to Nagumo's carriers. Akagi carried 6, Spacious Kaga hosted 9, and Hiryu and Soryu carried 3 apiece. These aircraft were stowed fully assembled because the reduction in Kid Butai's own air groups had made space available in the hangars. The 6th Q aviators had been welcomed warmly. Some of them were carrier-qualified pilots who could participate in combat activities in a pinch. Nagumo thus had a grand total of 248 aircraft aboard his ships. By way of comparison, Kid Butai's 6 carriers had brought around 412 aircraft to the Pearl Harbor operation. Nagumo was thus fighting the decisive battle with only 60% of the air power he might reasonably have expected to use as recently as May. If the aircraft situation was threadbare in the front-line carriers, it was far worse in the second-line carrier divisions. They were scraping up pilots and aircraft in any way they could to try and cobble together air groups, yet in most cases were falling short. Junyo's case is illustrative. Recently commissioned, she was designed to carry 54 aircraft. Her dive bomber group seems to have been reasonably intact, and was composed of 15 Type 99 aircraft. Her fighter group, however, was another matter. It was still in the midst of being activated and was in complete disarray. 12 of the 18 Zeros on board ship were actually aircraft from the 6th Q, yet 6th Q was itself 3 planes and several pilots short of its nominal 36 plane establishment, the remaining 21 aircraft being with Nagumo. Not only that, but 6th Q apparently didn't have enough aviators to man its own aircraft, nor could Junyo's aviators fill all the gaps. Indeed, Junyo's air group for the battle contained only 5 of its own pilots. The remainder were 4 6th Q pilots, a trio of aviators, one of whom was fresh out of flight school, on temporary attached duty, TAD, from Shokaku, and 2 more TAD flyers from Ryujo. At the same time, though, Junyo had sent one of her own fighter pilots, Tad, over to Soryu. Taken together, this meant that Junyo probably only carried 33 aircraft into battle. The point to be made is obvious. Not only was Junyo under strength, but also her fighter group at least was composed of men who did not know each other and who had never exercised together even once. The same was true for all the second-line carriers. Ryujo was carrying 30 aircraft of her 48 nominal, Zuiho 24 out of 30, and Hosho a mere 8 obsolete biplanes. In a word, after 6 months of war, the Japanese carrier force was tired. It needed rest, refit and replenishment of its air groups. It needed additional training. Above all, It needed time for the anemic Japanese aircraft industry to catch up to the demands of a full-scale war. For a navy supposedly on the top of its game, the air groups were going into the decisive battle in a decidedly shabby fashion, fatigued and desperately short of aircraft. Yet the men were counting on playing the same game they had played against the Allies for the first 6 months of the conflict, using their own superb aviators against inferior enemy pilots and planes. It had always worked before. Why not now as well? The problem, as some of the men must have suspected, was that they might be going back to the well once too often, and with too small a bucket. After 29th of May, the Japanese air groups did not participate in any further training. The Hikotai, other than patrol aircraft from the duty carriers, were stood down for final maintenance. The weather had been good for the first several days, and the eastward passage had been generally bland and unhurried. But as 1st June wore away, the weather began to turn, and Nagumo's force headed into hurrying clouds and a grey overcast. An observer hovering high over Midway on the morning of 2nd of June 1942 would have beheld a fascinating sight. Swarming over the horizon to the west and northwest were numerous Japanese naval task forces, most of which were converging on the tiny atoll below. Foremost among these was Nagumo's task force, followed at a distance of several hundred miles by Yamamoto's main body. The Aleutians' forces were already headed into the seemingly never-ending fog and overcast that surrounded their objectives. Almost due west of Midway, Tanaka's invasion force was flanked by Kondo and Kurita's battle groups. Ahead of them, the individual submarines of the cordon lines were picking their way toward their posts in solitary stealth. As far as the Japanese could tell, despite Nagumo's late departure, all was still going according to Yamamoto's design. Yet a further glance over the shoulder would have revealed a shocking sight. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown, had already sailed from Pearl Harbor and were even now poised for battle to the northeast of Midway. The events that led to the disclosure of Japan's designs at Midway to the enemy need only a brief retelling here. Just as American cryptographic prowess had allowed the US Navy to thwart Inouye's thrust into the Coral Sea, so too it had revealed Yamamoto's intentions concerning Midway. As a result, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was given enough warning, just barely, to assemble his forces in time to defend the island. It was a near-run thing, but the Americans showed great ingenuity and determination in using their more limited assets to the greatest possible effect. Nimitz had no clear idea as to Japanese intentions until very late in the game. It was not until 9th of May that American intelligence began suspecting that operations might be afoot in the Central Pacific, perhaps in the form of a raid against Hawaii. Around the same time, the American code-breaking station in Hawaii, known as HIPO, became aware of a forthcoming campaign that would demand the services of many battleships, carriers, and screening destroyers. Furthermore, after the mysterious operation, these forces were going to be reassembled at Saipan, which in turn indicated that the preceding operation would occur in the Central Pacific. At the same time, traffic analysis was recording an increase in message traffic between Akagi and subordinate commands like BAT-Div 3. In the eyes of HIPO, Midway became the logical place for such an operation. Nimitz himself was playing a dangerous game with his own superior, the demanding Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King remained nervous about a renewed Japanese offensive in the South Pacific, which his own intelligence chiefs were convinced remained the main objective of the Imperial Navy. Even before the Battle of Coral Sea, he had ordered Nimitz to commit Enterprise and Hornet to the region. Now, with Lexington sunk and Yorktown damaged, he wanted to keep them there. Nimitz, however, had confidence in the analysis of his intelligence staff and was determined to bring his carriers back to Pearl. In a daring move, Nimitz ordered Vice Admiral William Halsey, in an eyes-only communique to the latter aboard Enterprise, to deliberately expose his force to the Japanese. On the morning of 17th of May, Task Force 16 was sighted by a Japanese flying boat operating out of Tulagi. Hypo duly intercepted Japanese messages raising the alarm about American carriers, allowing Nimitz to use Halsey's manufactured sighting as reason to cancel his current mission and order Enterprise and Hornet back to Hawaii. Meanwhile, Nimitz and Hypo still needed a breakthrough that would definitely confirm Midway as Japan's near-term objective. Nimitz's cryptographers devised an ingenious stratagem to divine the location of the attack. On 19th of May, on instructions from Hypo, Midway's radio station broadcast in clear that the island's desalinization plant had broken down. Just 1 day later, the Americans broke a Japanese message giving the objective's call sign, MI, and indicating that a watership should accompany the occupation forces. The Americans now definitely knew that Midway was the target of the forthcoming Japanese offensive. While the timing of the operation was still in doubt, the first cornerstone of Yamamoto's plan, the element of strategic surprise, had been irretrievably lost. Another of Yamamoto's fundamental assumptions that the US Navy would need to be coaxed into battle was erroneous as well. In fact, Nimitz was spoiling for a fight. His beliefs mirrored Yamamoto's in at least one regard. The most effective way to win the war was to bring the enemy's carriers to battle and defeat them. Nimitz's willingness to fight rested on two assumptions. First, he was convinced that his commanders and crewmen, as demonstrated in the Coral Sea battles, were the match of their Japanese opposite numbers. Second, Nimitz believed that his advantage in strategic intelligence would allow his forces to ambush Kido Butai. Now his only problem was finding the necessary numbers of carriers. Hypo's estimates indicated that the Japanese would launch their attack with 4 or 5 flat tops, probably operating in 2 groups. Nimitz had to figure out how to roughly match their numbers. The US Navy had begun the war with 7 carriers. One of these, Ranger, was no longer deemed fit for frontline service. This left 6 fleet units: Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet, and Wasp. The Lexington had been sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. Wasp was currently engaged in the Mediterranean, ferrying British Spitfires to Malta, although she had been ordered to move to the Pacific immediately thereafter. Saratoga, having been torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on 11th of January, had been repairing and refitting on the west coast, and as of the end of May was still furiously putting together her air group and collecting enough escorts to sail. She would not be able to reach Pearl Harbor until 7th June. American intelligence estimates had the Japanese opening operations against Midway as early as 2nd of June, meaning that their own carriers would need to be in position off the island by the 1st. Saratoga was therefore out of the picture. This left the Yorktown-class carriers available to contest Japanese moves. Unfortunately, Yorktown herself had been badly damaged by bombs during the same battle that had claimed the Lexington at Coral Sea. Trailing a slick of oil from storage tanks that had been cracked as a result of a near miss, she had limped back to Pearl Harbor, arriving the same day Nagumo had sorted. Yet her presence in the coming Midway operation was absolutely vital. Although Nimitz was willing to do it, he knew that pitting just 2 American carriers against 4 of their Japanese opposite numbers was an extremely risky proposition, even with Midway-based aircraft backing them up. But with the addition of a 3rd flight deck, the US Navy could match the Japanese in total numbers of aircraft. It was essential that Yorktown be returned to working order as soon as possible. In contrast with the Japanese lack of urgency about getting Zuikaku back into action, the Americans had moved heaven and earth on Yorktown's behalf. Returning to Pearl Harbor on 27th of May, she had first entered the repair basin, where 1,000 to 400 workmen had clambered on board and gotten to work. She was then into dry dock on the 28th. Realistically, Yorktown needed a 3-month refit. Instead, she would receive slightly more than 48 hours of emergency repairs. It was an all-hands, around-the-clock effort, with some of the personnel simply working straight through without sleep. At the same time, Yorktown received replacements of 3 of her squadrons. Saratoga's Bombing 3, VB3, took the place of Yorktown's Scouting 5, VS5, which had suffered heavy casualties at Coral Sea. Likewise, Fighting 3 largely replaced VF-42, and Torpedo 3 replaced VT-5. The fact that the Americans could insert replacement air groups into a carrier that they had never served aboard, while the Japanese hadn't even attempted a similar operation with the surviving aircraft from Shokaku that had already been sitting in Zuikaku, gives testimony to the superior organizational skills that the US Navy was already beginning to draw upon in the conflict. By 0900 on 30th of May, Yorktown headed back to sea, forming the core of American Task Force 17. She carried 76 aircraft, 25 F-4F fighters, 37 SBD dive bombers, and 14 TBD torpedo bombers. With Yorktown went 2 heavy cruisers, Astoria and Portland, and 5 destroyers, Hammond, Hughes, Morris, Anderson, and Russell. Yorktown's 2 sister ships, Enterprise and Hornet, had sortied the day before as Task Force 16. Enterprise carried 78 aircraft, 27 F-4F fighters, 37 SBD dive bombers, and 14 TBD torpedo bombers. Hornet carried 77, 27 F-4F fighters, 35 SBD dive bombers, and 15 TBD torpedo bombers. Around them were the heavy cruisers New Orleans, Minneapolis, Vincennes, Northampton, and Pensacola, and the brand-new light cruiser Atlanta. A screen of 9 destroyers Phelps, Worden, Monaghan, Aylwin, Balk, Conyngham, Benham, Ellet, and Maury completed the force. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, flying his flag in Yorktown, would have tactical command of the carrier striking forces, as well as direct control over TF-17. He was a veteran of much action already in the war, having been at sea since the commencement of hostilities. Fletcher was a careful commander, and certainly somewhat more cautious than his counterpart Halsey. He had been taught some lessons in this regard at the Battle of Coral Sea just prior. Much like Admiral Takagi, the American commander had struck an aggressive blow against what he presumed to be the main Japanese task force, only to discover that he had launched an all-out attack against the light carrier Shoho. While sinking her was useful, it had been something of a waste and had left Fletcher's own forces exposed. It was an error he did not intend to repeat. By rights, Fletcher's senior officer in Task Force 16 should have been Vice Admiral Halsey, who had commanded the forces centered on Enterprise since the beginning of the war. However, Halsey had recently contracted shingles, making it impossible for him to sleep. As a result, upon returning to Pearl, he was immediately placed on medical leave, leaving a gap in the command structure. Nimitz asked Halsey for his recommendation for a replacement, and to Nimitz's great surprise, he nominated his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Spruance was not a carrier man and had never commanded a mixed task force before. Nevertheless, Halsey had such complete confidence in his abilities that Nimitz was persuaded that Spruance would make a sound choice. It is ironic that the hot-tempered and profane Halsey had such utter faith in a man so completely his opposite. Spruance was a very cool customer. A man defined almost totally by his intellect, he was articulate, careful, methodical, and extremely attentive to detail. Upon assuming command of Task Force 16, he wasn't overawed by his own lack of knowledge regarding naval aviation. But he also had the intellectual honesty to be aware of his shortcomings, and he took rapid steps to fill in the gaps. As events were to prove, he was also aggressive, calculating, and a commander who would not panic in adversity. Altogether, the American carriers brought 233 aircraft to the fight, just 15 fewer than Nagumo's carrier force. However, the American carriers had much less experience in joint operations than did the Japanese. Furthermore, Task Force 16 and 17 intended to fight separately, often out of eyesight of each other, making coordination problematic. It was hoped, however, that dispersal would make it more difficult for the Japanese to detect and attack all of the American carriers simultaneously. Nimitz had not been idle in reinforcing Midway's own air strength. Commanded by Captain Cyril T. Simard, Midway was currently operating 4 squadrons, composed of 31 PBY Catalina patrol planes. These planes were aggressively pushing reconnaissance flights out to 700 miles from the atoll. By 4th June, Eastern Island's airstrip was stuffed to the rafters with another 96 aircraft of all sorts, including Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Force attack planes. There was a squadron of 17 B-17 heavy bombers, as well as a foursome of B-26 medium bombers fitted for carrying torpedoes. The Marines had contributed a squadron of 21 old Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and 7 F-4F Wildcats, and a squadron of 19 SBD dive bombers and 21 older SB-2U scout bombers. The Navy brought in a detachment of 6 brand-new TBF torpedo planes and a light utility plane. In all, 127 U.S. aircraft were temporarily calling Midway home. The increase in the numbers and range of patrols, as well as the much larger air group at the base, meant that by 1st June the base's aviation fuel consumption had exploded to 65,000 gallons daily, against a total of about 150,000 gallons of avgas storage on the island. Keeping the air station supplied with fuel was quickly becoming a problem. Nimitz placed his forces brilliantly, ordering Fletcher to hold his carriers some 300 miles to the northeast of Kido Butai's anticipated axis of advance. From this otherwise indistinguishable spot of ocean, named Point Luck, 32N 173W, his carriers would be in a position to ambush the Japanese after the enemy launched their aircraft against Midway. By steering clear of the waters south of the island, he was well positioned to avoid any possible entanglements with the various advancing Japanese formations. Here, the Americans were more exposed to attack, but they were also in a better position to launch their own surprise assault on the Japanese flank. Nimitz didn't know the exact composition of the enemy forces, but he was confident that he could give battle under favourable terms as long as he retained the element of surprise. He had also deployed a strong group of 12 American fleet boats around Midway itself, which would hopefully weaken any Japanese force and open it up to attack. Despite the boldness of his plan, Nimitz felt no need for a do-or-die effort in defence of the atoll. He expected his carrier admirals to attack aggressively but judiciously, seeking opportunities to inflict maximum damage at the minimum cost in what was termed strong attritional tactics. Under no circumstances were the carriers to be sacrificed unnecessarily. If the situation became untenable, they were to back off and let the Japanese attempt an invasion. Nimitz understood the logistical situation of the atoll better than the Japanese did themselves, knowing that he would be in a better position to retake the islands than the Japanese would be to defend it. As a result, preserving the 3 American flight decks was more important than preserving the Marine garrison there. However, the Marines had taken their own measures to ensure that if it ever came to a fight, they would be able to face the Japanese on the best terms possible. Their 6th Defence Battalion, under the energetic leadership of Colonel Harold D. Shannon, had been stiffened by the addition of 2 companies of elite Marine raiders. A platoon of light tanks had been sequestered in the tiny pine forest at the centre of Sand Island. The men had engaged in a frenzy of defensive preparations, digging multiple lines of emplacements, hardening heavy weapons sites, and clearing fields of fire across the beaches. They had laid thickets of barbed wire around their perimeters and entrenched their communications lines, and they had improvised an array of lethal explosive booby traps and mines to strew across the beaches and landing approaches. Midway's 2 islands now bristled with defences. Even a heavily supported Japanese landing would have found the going very difficult. The same was hardly true of the Japanese. Indeed, an omniscient observer would also have noticed that by this time the Japanese strategic scouting plan for Operation MI had fallen completely to pieces. The submarine cordon lines, upon which Nagumo was counting for early warning of northward advancing Americans, were tardy in taking their positions, having left Kwajalein late. But even had they left on time, they would have missed the American carriers. By the time Cordon A and B were established, the Americans had already slipped past it. The reasons for the failure of the submarine picket lines, which were not properly understood until after the war, verge on the scandalous. The commander of 6th Fleet, Japan's submarine forces, was Vice Admiral Marquis Komatsu Teruhisa, the cousin of the Empress of Japan and a close personal friend of Emperor Hirohito. The Marquis was a great fan of Yamamoto's and had such confidence in the Midway operation that in his opinion the battle was as good as won. So much so, in fact, that he was already preoccupied with follow-up plans to attack the Panama Canal and terrorize California. He thus paid little attention to the nuts and bolts of the deployment against Midway. While he was supposed to be at the staff planning sessions held on board Yamato, Komatsu did not attend, sending his staff instead. Furthermore, according to Gordon Prange, the submarine cordon details never appeared in the official orders for Operation MI. Writing up the submarine portion of such orders was a normal responsibility of Commander Arima Takayasu, Yamamoto's submarine officer. But for some reason, Captain Kuroshima told Arima that he had no need to do so. This rather incredible oversight meant that the Japanese boats were committed to action without a workable operational plan. Furthermore, the boats that were tasked for the operation, the older vessels of Subron 5, were far from ideal for the mission. None of them could dive safely past 200 feet, and all of them were under refit during the April-May period, with the intent of being shortly moved into the reserve fleet and relegated to training purposes. Not surprisingly, Commander Yura Shojir of Naval GHQ's submarine staff protested to Admiral Fukudome that the boats were too slow and bulky to get on station in a timely manner, nor could they cope with air attacks and patrols once they got there. His protests fell on deaf ears. As matters developed, Yura was completely correct in his estimation of Subron 5's weaknesses. Their overhauls took too long, and the boats were late in leaving Kwajalein, departing between 26 and 30 May. Worse yet, the long daylight hours, coupled with intensifying American patrol activity, meant that the boats had only limited time during the night to transit on the surface. During the days they were often forced to dive to avoid Catalinas, creeping forward submerged as best they could. The result was that while the boats were scheduled to be in place by 1st June, local, some of them didn't reach their stations until 3rd June, by which time the American carriers had already passed through. Had the American task forces been sighted in the vicinity, Yamamoto and Nagumo would have had both actionable information and the time to make last-minute adjustments to their operational plans. As it was, they received neither. This would have been bad enough, but even worse was the fact that Admiral Komatsu was fully aware that his force had taken up their stations late, but did not relay this up the chain of command. On or about 3rd of June, Komatsu notified Admiral Yamamoto of the failure of Operation K, described shortly. However, he did not call Yamamoto's attention to the fact that his picket submarines had arrived late on station. Obviously, this was a serious oversight, if oversight it was. The net result was that not only did Yamamoto and Nagumo not know whether the American carriers had sortied toward Midway or not, they weren't even aware that they didn't know. In fact, they didn't know that there was any problem with their scouting arrangements at all. It would appear that because of Komatsu's membership in the imperial family, he was never held to account for this crucial failure. As one observer later noted, Japanese historians in later years would allude to the event only obliquely, and American historians would necessarily follow the lead of the Japanese. One example of such an oblique reference is supplied by Admiral Ugaki, who remarked after the battle in his diary that "we failed to make good use of subs in reconnaissance, despite having ordered the cordons in place to prevent the very sort of ambush that in fact occurred." Komatsu's oversights, though, might have been made good if the Japanese were willing to put some of the other pieces of the puzzle together. Indeed, as the Japanese advanced, they began receiving evidence that the Americans were wise to at least some of Yamamoto's initial deployments. On 30th of May, shortly after Admiral Tanaka's invasion force sortied from Saipan, an American submarine dead ahead had been overheard broadcasting a long coded message of an urgent nature. Given that Tanaka's force was on course almost directly for its ultimate objective, it would not take much for the Americans to figure out where he was headed. In addition, the Japanese had noted via radio intercepts that an increased number of American submarines were operating in the mid-Pacific and Aleutians. Closer to the battle area, Operation K, the seaplane scouting effort aimed at assessing the status of Pearl Harbor had to be aborted on the 31st. One of the Japanese refueling subs, the I-121, approaching French frigate shoals on the 27th, had found that the previously isolated islet had now become the abode of an American seaplane tender and her destroyer consort. The Japanese submarine was shortly joined by her sister, I-123, but the Americans showed no signs of departing. On the 30th, I-123 reluctantly radioed headquarters at Kwajalein regarding the setback. Operation K was postponed for 24 hours in the vain hope that the Americans would move on the following day. However, the next morning American flying boats were now seen moored in the lagoon. French frigate Shoals was clearly an operational American seaplane base. Attacking their ships would only bring attention to the area, but without them gone, there was no way that the huge Kawanishi flying boats could refuel. Operation K had to be scrubbed, thus depriving Nagumo of any intelligence regarding the Americans' main fleet base. Submarine I-168, meanwhile, had been scouting Midway itself. Her captain, Lt. Commander Tanabe Yahachi, submitted a comprehensive report on 2 June concerning the activities he had observed there. The atoll was mounting an average of nearly 100 flights daily. The seaplanes were gone much of the daylight hours, meaning that they were patrolling aggressively out to great distances. At night, blazing work lights indicated that construction was proceeding around the clock. Midway did not appear to be a sleepy backwater unaware of its approaching fate. On the contrary, the atoll had every appearance of an outpost doubly on its guard. Commander Tanabe's reports were duly sent up the chain of command, but apparently didn't make much of an impression. Japanese radio intercept stations in Japan, Truk and Saipan had also noticed that American radio traffic emanating from Hawaii was up. Additionally, many of the orders being sent by Nimitz to his subordinates were tagged urgent. Taken together, Japanese traffic analysis seemed to indicate that American heavy forces were probably operating at sea rather than sitting in Pearl Harbor. The question is, how much of this information actually came into Nagumo's hands as he sailed toward battle, and did he act on it? The conventional wisdom, as promulgated by Fuchida Mitsuo's post-war account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, is that Nagumo was completely in the dark regarding all of these matters except the failure of Operation K. Nagumo's own report states flatly that the Americans were not aware of Japanese plans and that his forces were not discovered until the morning of 4th June Midway time. Fuchida blamed this failure in part on combined fleet staff's decision on board Yamato to not transmit information forward to Nagumo, and also on Akagi's poor communications capabilities, resulting from her allegedly small island and limited number of radio aerials. However, neither of these excuses really stands up to scrutiny. First of all, Akagi's problems with communications, if there were any, likely had less to do with the number or quality of her aerials than it did with their height above the surface of the ocean. All Japanese carriers suffered from this problem, in that they had relatively small bridge structures and mainmasts. Consequently, there were few places high in the ship to place an aerial, which in turn explains their location on the sides of the flight decks. When flight operations were underway, they were cranked into their horizontal positions, away from the flight deck and any potential accidents, thus lowering them further and hampering their use for communications. This was a known weakness of making an aircraft carrier a flagship, yet the Japanese accepted these drawbacks to exercise better local control over the task force's various air groups. However, despite these shortcomings, it is equally clear that Kido Butai's communications did not rely solely on Akagi's equipment.